The morning sun barely pierced through the grimy windows of Mitchell's Diner on Route 47, casting long shadows across the checkered linoleum floor. It was here, in this forgotten corner of Cedar Falls, Michigan, that two broken souls would collide. In the most unexpected way, changing not just their own lives, but the life of a 6-year-old boy who had been waiting for a miracle he didn't even know how to ask for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Morrison pushed through the heavy glass door of Mitchell's Diner, the familiar brass bell announcing his arrival with its tired chime. His work boots scraped against the worn floor as he made his way to the corner booth, the same one he'd claimed every Tuesday morning for the past 8 months. The vinyl seat had molded to his frame, a testament to the routine that had become his lifeline after everything fell apart. The autumn wind rattled the windows as Jake settled into his usual spot, pulling off his construction helmet and running calloused fingers through his dark hair. At 32, he looked older than his years. The weight of single parenthood had etched lines around his green eyes that hadn't been there when Emma was still alive. 6 months. It had been 6 months since the accident that took his wife and left him to navigate the impossible task of raising their son, Tommy, alone. Coffee, black, and the usual? Called out Marge from behind the counter. The 60-something waitress had been working at Mitchell's since Jake was in high school, and her gravelly voice carried the warmth of familiarity. "Make it a double today," Jake replied, glancing at his watch. 7:15. He had exactly 45 minutes before he needed to pick up Tommy from his neighbor Mrs. Chun's house and drive him to school. 45 minutes to steel himself for another day of pretending he had everything under control. The diner was nearly empty, save for old Bill Henderson nursing his 3rd cup of coffee at the counter and reading yesterday's newspaper. The morning rush wouldn't start for another hour, when the factory workers from the industrial district would flood in for their caffeine fix and greasy breakfast sandwiches. Jake preferred it this way, quiet, predictable, safe. That's when she walked in. Woman who stumbled through the door looked like she'd been running through a hurricane. Her wedding dress, yes, a wedding dress, was torn at the hem and stained with what looked like mud and tears. The elaborate veil hung askew, caught in her disheveled auburn hair, and her makeup had long since surrendered to gravity and grief. She stood in the doorway for a moment, swaying slightly, before her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the nearest chair. Jake's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. In all his years of breakfast solitude at Mitchell's, he'd never seen anything quite like this. The woman, she couldn't have been more than 28, buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and raw. Marge appeared at the woman's table with the speed of someone who'd seen it all in her decades of diner service. "Honey, what can I get you? Coffee? Water? A phone to call someone?" The woman looked up, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of blue that seemed to shift with her emotions. Her face was round and soft, with full cheeks that were now blotchy from crying. She was, by any measure, a beautiful woman, though Jake could see she carried herself as if she believed otherwise. I don't have anywhere to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ancient refrigerator in the corner. "I don't have anyone to call." Jake found himself leaning forward, straining to hear her words. Something about her vulnerability struck a chord in his chest, the same protective instinct that kicked in whenever Tommy scraped his knee or had a nightmare about monsters under his bed. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Marge asked, sliding into the booth across from her with the practiced ease of someone who'd counseled countless broken hearts over coffee and pie. "Sophia Hayes." She dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, smearing what remained of her mascara. "I was supposed to be Sophia Parker by now, but—" Her voice trailed off as fresh tears threatened to spill. Jake's attention was fully captured now. He'd abandoned any pretense of reading the morning paper or checking his phone. There was something about this woman, this Sophia, that made him want to understand what had brought her to this moment, in this place, looking like her world had just ended. "What happened, honey?" Marge's voice carried the gentle authority of a mother and the curiosity of someone who'd collected stories like souvenirs for decades. Sophia took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she reached for the glass of water Marge had placed in front of her. The wedding was supposed to start at 10 this morning. Everything was perfect. The flowers, the church, the reception hall. 3 years of planning, every detail accounted for. She paused, staring out the window at the empty parking lot where a few scattered leaves danced in the wind. I was in the bridal suite, putting on the final touches. My mother was fussing with my veil, and my maid of honor was taking pictures. I felt beautiful for the first time in ... well, maybe ever. Jake noticed how she spoke about beauty as if it were a foreign concept, something she'd borrowed rather than owned. He'd seen that look before. Emma used to get that same expression when she'd catch her reflection unexpectedly and be surprised by what she saw. Then I realized I'd forgotten my grandmother's ring upstairs. It was supposed to be something old. I told everyone I'd be right back and went up to get it. Sophia's voice grew quieter, more distant. That's when I heard them. The diner seemed to grow smaller around her words, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Even Bill at the counter had stopped rustling his newspaper. Richard, my fiancé, was in the hallway, outside the groom's room, talking to his brother and his college friends. They didn't know I was there. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold the pieces together. His brother asked him if he was sure about marrying me, if he was really ready to be tied down to someone like me. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd heard enough locker room talk in his construction crew to know where this was heading, and he already felt a surge of anger on behalf of this woman he'd never met. Richard laughed. He actually laughed. Sophia's voice cracked. He said he'd thought about calling it off, but that I was safe, that I wasn't the type of woman other men would want, so he wouldn't have to worry about me cheating or leaving him. He said I was too fat and too insecure to do better than him. The words hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Jake felt his hands clench into fists under the table. In his peripheral vision, he could see Marge's face darken with the kind of righteous anger that came from years of watching people hurt each other in ways that made no sense. His friends were laughing too, Sophia continued, her voice now barely above a whisper. They were making jokes about how he'd never have to worry about me fitting into my old jeans after we had kids, because I already didn't fit into anything. They said at least he'd found someone who would be grateful for whatever attention he gave her. Jake found himself standing before he'd consciously decided to move. The protective fury that had been building in his chest demanded action, though he wasn't sure what kind. This woman, this Sophia, was a complete stranger. Yet hearing about her humiliation felt personal in a way he couldn't explain. "So what did you do?" Marge asked, though her tone suggested she was proud of whatever came next. For the first time since she'd entered the diner, Sophia's expression shifted. A ghost of a smile played at the corners of her mouth, and Jake caught a glimpse of the strength that lived beneath her current devastation. "I walked right up to them," she said, her voice gaining volume and conviction. "I stood there in my beautiful dress, with my grandmother's ring in my hand, and I told Richard exactly what I thought of him and his opinions." "Good for you, honey," Marge said, refilling Sophia's water glass. "What did you say?" "I told him that he was right about one thing I could do better than him. Much better. I told him that any man who would say those things about the woman he was about to marry wasn't worth the breath it would take to say, 'I don't' instead of 'I do.'" Jake found himself nodding in approval. Whatever else this woman was, she wasn't a doormat. Then I walked back into the bridal suite, grabbed my purse, and climbed out the window. She laughed, a sound that was half hysteria and half liberation. Thank God it was on the first floor. I hiked up my dress and ran through the parking lot, across 2 streets, and kept running until I couldn't run anymore. That's when I saw this place. She gestured around the diner as if it were a sanctuary, which Jake realized it probably was. There was something about Mitchell's that attracted lost souls and broken hearts. Maybe it was Marge's coffee, or maybe it was just the kind of place where people could fall apart without judgment. So here I am, Sophia said, spreading her arms wide. Sitting in a diner in my wedding dress with nowhere to go and no one to call. My parents live in Florida, and they spent their retirement savings on this wedding. My maid of honor is Richard's sister, so calling her is out of the question. My closest friends are all back at the church, probably wondering where the bride disappeared to. Jake found himself calculating the time, 7:40. He had 20 minutes before he needed to leave for Tommy, but something was keeping him rooted to his spot. This woman's story, her courage in the face of such cruelty, stirred something in him that had been dormant since Emma's death. "What's your plan now?" he asked, surprising himself by speaking up. Sophia turned to look at him for the first time, really look at him. Her storm-gray eyes studied his face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "I don't have one," she admitted. "I have about $60 in my purse, no car, and nowhere to stay. I guess I'll figure it out as I go." The practical part of Jake's mind, the part that had been hardened by months of single parenthood and the constant weight of responsibility, told him to finish his coffee, pay his bill, and leave. He had his own problems, his own struggles. He didn't need to take on someone else's drama, especially not someone whose life was clearly in chaos. But there was another part of him, a part that Emma used to tease him about, that couldn't walk away from someone in need. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was the same part that had made him stop to help stranded motorists, to volunteer for charity drives, to always be the first to offer assistance when his neighbors needed help. Emma used to call it his white knight complex, but she'd said it with affection, as if it were one of the things she loved most about him. "There's a motel about 5 miles down Route 47, he heard himself saying. "The Pinaview Inn. It's not fancy, but it's clean and cheap. $45 a night." Sophia's eyes filled with tears again, but these seemed different from the ones she'd been crying when she first walked in. "Thank you," she said. "That's very kind of you to tell me." Jake glanced at his watch again. 15 minutes. He should leave now if he wanted to maintain his morning routine, if he wanted to keep his life in the neat, manageable boxes he'd constructed since Emma's death. But something about the way Sophia sat there, trying to look brave while her world crumbled around her, reminded him of Tommy on his worst days. The days when his 6-year-old son would try to pretend he wasn't sad about his mom being gone, when he'd put on a brave face that was too big for his small features. "I could give you a ride," Jake said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I mean, if you want. I have to pick up my son from a neighbor's house first, but I could drop you off at the motel after that." The gratitude that flooded Sophia's face was almost overwhelming. "I couldn't ask you to do that. You don't even know me." "You're not asking," Jake replied, standing up and reaching for his wallet. "I'm offering." And sometimes that's how it works, strangers helping strangers. As he dropped a $10 bill on the table for his coffee and a generous tip for Marge, Jake wondered what Emma would think of this moment. Would she approve of him helping a runaway bride? Would she understand the pull he felt to protect this woman who had shown such courage in the face of humiliation? "What's your name?" Sophia asked as she carefully stood up, gathering the train of her dress in her arms. "Jake Morrison," he said, holding the door open for her. "And you're about to meet my son, Tommy. Fair warning, he asks a lot of questions." As they stepped out into the crisp autumn morning, Jake felt something shift inside him. For the first time in months, his carefully constructed routine was being disrupted, and instead of the anxiety he expected to feel, there was something else entirely. It felt almost like hope, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The drive to Mrs. Rowe Chun's house took exactly 7 minutes, a fact Jake knew because he'd timed it obsessively when he first started this arrangement. Sophia sat quietly in the passenger seat of his pickup truck, her dress billowing around her like a cloud of white tulle and lace. She'd managed to remove most of the veil, but pieces of it still clung to her hair like confetti from a celebration. That never happened. "Thank you," she said as they pulled into Mrs. Chun's driveway. "For the ride, for the coffee recommendation, for everything. I know you don't owe me anything." Jake turned off the engine and studied her profile. In the natural light, he could see that she really was beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with the conventional standards that had clearly been used to hurt her. There was a softness to her features, a warmth in her eyes that spoke of kindness and depth. Richard, whoever he was an idiot. "Nobody should have to go through what you went through this morning," Jake said simply. "Nobody deserves to be talked about like that, especially not by someone who's supposed to love them." Before Sophia could respond, the front door of the small house burst open, and Tommy came running down the driveway, his backpack bouncing against his small frame. At 6 years old, he was all energy and curiosity, with Jake's green eyes and Emma's infectious smile. Dad. Mrs. Chun made pancakes, and they had chocolate chips, and I helped flip them and only burned one a little bit." The words tumbled out of him in the breathless way that only children could manage. Then Tommy stopped short, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of Sophia in her wedding dress. "Whoa," he breathed. "Are you a princess?" Jake felt his heart clench at the innocent wonder in his son's voice. Tommy had been fascinated by princesses and fairy tales lately, probably because they represented the kind of magic and happy endings that seemed to be missing from his own life. Sophia's face transformed as she looked at Tommy. The sadness and uncertainty melted away, replaced by genuine warmth and delight. "Not exactly a princess," she said, her voice gentle. "More like someone who's having an adventure." "What kind of adventure?" Tommy asked, climbing into the truck and settling into his booster seat. "Are you running away from a dragon?" "Something like that," Sophia replied, catching Jake's eye in the rearview mirror. There was something in her expression, a mixture of pain and amusement, that made Jake's chest tighten with emotion he wasn't ready to name. As they drove toward Tommy's school, Jake found himself listening to the easy conversation flowing between his son and this woman who had stumbled into their morning routine. Tommy was telling Sophia about his teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, and how they were learning about butterflies and metamorphosis. Sophia listened with the kind of attention that children craved, asking follow-up questions and making appropriate sounds of amazement. Metamorphosis is when something changes into something completely different, Tommy explained with the seriousness of a 6-year-old sharing important knowledge, like how a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. It goes into a cocoon, and when it comes out, it's totally different, but also still the same. "That sounds like a very special kind of magic," Sophia said, and Jake caught her looking at him in the side mirror. "Sometimes people go through metamorphosis too." "Really?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Really," Sophia confirmed. "Sometimes when something scary or sad happens, it's actually the beginning of becoming something better. Like the caterpillar, it probably thinks the world is ending when it goes into that cocoon, but really it's just getting ready to fly." Jake felt something profound in those words, as if Sophia had somehow captured the essence of what they were all going through. Tommy with his grief over losing his mother, Jake with his struggle to rebuild their life, and Sophia with whatever came next after having her world turned upside down. When they arrived at Oakwood Elementary, Tommy bounded out of the truck with his usual enthusiasm. but then turned back to Sophia with a serious expression. "I hope your adventure has a happy ending," he said with the earnestness that only children could muster. "Like in the stories." "Thank you, Tommy," Sophia replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I hope so too." As they watched Tommy disappear through the school's front doors, Jake found himself reluctant to start the engine again. The next part of his day, driving Sophia to the motel and then continuing on to his construction job, felt like the end of something he wasn't ready to let go of. "He's wonderful," Sophia said softly. "You're lucky to have him." "Yeah," Jake agreed, though the word carried the weight of everything he didn't say. Lucky to have Tommy, unlucky to be raising him alone. Lucky to have had Emma, unlucky to have lost her so soon. Lucky to have stumbled across Sophia this morning, though. He wasn't sure yet what that luck might mean. As they drove toward the Pinneview Inn, Jake found himself stealing glances at the woman beside him. In the span of an hour, she had gone from being a complete stranger to someone whose story had somehow become intertwined with his own. He didn't know what happened next for her, for him, or for Tommy, but for the first time in months, he found himself curious about the future instead of just surviving it. The Pinneview Inn sat at the intersection of Route 47 and Maple Street, a low-slung building that had seen better decades, but maintained a certain dignity in its decline. The parking lot was mostly empty, which wasn't surprising for a Tuesday morning, and the neon sign flickers intermittently as if it couldn't quite decide whether it wanted to stay lit. Jake pulled up to the office and put the truck in park, but neither of them moved to get out. The weight of the morning's events seemed to settle between them, creating a bubble of intimacy that felt both comfortable and dangerous. "I should let you get to work," Sophia said, though she made no move toward the door handle. "I should get to work," Jake agreed, though he found himself reluctant to end this unexpected chapter of his morning routine. They sat in silence for a moment, both staring at the motel office where a bored-looking clerk was visible through the window, reading a magazine and occasionally glancing up at their truck. "Jake," Sophia said finally, her voice soft but determined, "what you did this morning, helping me, listening to me, giving me a ride, it meant more than you know. I want you to understand that." "You don't have to thank me," Jake replied, though. He found her gratitude warming something in his chest that had been cold for months. "Yes, I do," she insisted. "What Richard and his friends said about me, ... It wasn't the first time I'd heard things like that. I've spent most of my life believing that I wasn't worth much, that I should be grateful for any attention or affection I received. But sitting there in that diner, watching you get angry on my behalf, seeing Tommy look at me like I might actually be someone special, it reminded me that maybe I've been wrong about my own worth." Jake turned to face her fully, struck by the raw honesty in her voice. "You were never wrong about your worth," he said firmly. "But maybe you were wrong about who gets to decide what that worth is." The smile that spread across Sophia's face was like sunrise after a long night, slow, warm, and full of promise. "Maybe I was," she agreed. Jake watched Sophia disappear through the glass doors of the Pinneview Inn office, her wedding dress trailing behind her like the remnants of a dream. Something inside him felt unsettled as he drove away, as if he'd left something important unfinished. The construction site where he worked was only 12 minutes from the motel, but those 12 minutes stretched like hours as his mind replayed the morning's events. The Riverside construction project was a new shopping complex on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, the kind of development that promised to revitalize the local economy while simultaneously changing the character of the small town forever. Jake had been working as a foreman on the project for 8 months, ever since he'd moved back to his hometown after Emma's accident. The work was steady, the pay was decent, and it kept his hands busy enough that his mind couldn't wander too far into dangerous territory. "You're late, Morrison," called out Danny Reeves, the site supervisor, as Jake climbed out of his truck. Danny was a good man in his 50s who'd known Jake's father back when the elder Morrison had worked construction in the area. "Everything okay at home?" Jake grabbed his hard hat and tool belt from the truck bed, considering how to answer. Everything at home was the same as it had been yesterday and the day before, a careful balance of responsibility and loneliness, punctuated by Tommy's laughter and the echo of Emma's absence. But this morning had introduced variables he didn't know how to categorize. "Just ran into someone who needed help," Jake said finally, which was true enough without being the whole truth. "Good man," Danny nodded approvingly. "Your dad raised you right. Now get up to the 3rd floor. We're behind schedule on the electrical rough-in." The morning passed in a blur of conduit installation and wire pulling, the familiar rhythm of physical labor providing a temporary escape from the complexity of his thoughts. But every time Jake caught himself thinking about Sophia, wondering if she'd managed to get a room, if she had enough money for food, if she had anyone to call, he forced his attention back to the task at hand. He had learned, in the months since Emma's death, that dwelling on things beyond his control was a luxury he couldn't afford. It was during his lunch break, sitting on a stack of lumber with his sandwich and thermos of coffee, that his phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar. "Hello, Mr. Morrison? This is Principal Walsh from Oakwood Elementary. I'm calling about Tommy." Jake's heart immediately shifted into overdrive, the way it always did when the school called. In the months since Emma's death, every phone call from Tommy's school felt like a potential crisis, another sign that he was failing at the most important job he'd ever had. Is he hurt? Is he sick? Jake was already standing, scanning the parking lot for his truck keys. No, nothing like that," Principal Walsh assured him quickly. "Tommy's fine physically. But his teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, asked me to call because she's concerned about something that happened during morning circle time." Jake felt his shoulders relax slightly, but his guard remained up. Tommy had been struggling with behavioral issues since starting 1st grade, not acting out exactly, but withdrawing in ways that worried his teachers. The school counselor had gently suggested that Tommy was having difficulty processing his grief, that 6-year-olds often expressed their emotions in ways adults didn't immediately recognize. What happened? Well, during sharing time, Tommy told the class about meeting a princess this morning who was on an adventure. Mrs. Rodriguez said he was more animated and talkative than he's been in weeks, which is wonderful. But then he started asking questions about what happens to princesses when their adventures don't have happy endings. Jake closed his eyes, understanding immediately what had happened. Tommy, with his 6-year-old logic and his recent fascination with fairy tales, had somehow connected Sophia's story to his own experience of loss. The questions about unhappy endings weren't really about princesses at all. Mrs. Rodriguez handled it beautifully, Principal Walsh continued. But we thought you should know, in case Tommy brings up similar concerns at home. Sometimes children use metaphors to express feelings they don't have words for yet. Thank you for calling, Jake said, already calculating how long it would take him to get to the school if needed. Is there anything I should do? Just be available to listen if he wants to talk. And Mr. Morrison? The fact that Tommy was excited to share something positive this morning, that's actually a very good sign. We haven't seen him this engaged in quite a while. After hanging up, Jake stared at his phone for a long moment. In trying to help Sophia, had he somehow helped Tommy too? Or had he simply added another layer of complexity to his son's already complicated emotional landscape? The afternoon dragged on with unusual slowness. Every task seemed to take twice as long as it should, and Jake found himself checking his watch more frequently than usual. At 3:30, he packed up his tools and headed to Oakwood Elementary for pickup, arriving 10 minutes earlier than usual. Tommy emerged from the school building with his typical burst of energy, but today there was something different about him. His green eyes seemed brighter, more focused, and he practically bounced as he climbed into his booster seat. Dad, guess what we learned about today? What's that, buddy? Metamorphosis. Just like the princess said this morning. Mrs. Rodriguez showed us pictures of butterflies and moths and beetles that all change into completely different things. And she said that sometimes when sad things happen to people, they can change too, but in good ways. Jake's chest tightened with a mixture of pride and concern. What do you think about that? Tommy was quiet for a moment, his small hands fidgeting with the straps of his backpack. Do you think Mommy had metamorphosis when she went to heaven? The question hit Jake like a physical blow. In all their conversations about Emma's death, Tommy had never asked anything quite like this. They'd talked about heaven in the abstract, terms that well-meaning relatives had provided, but Tommy had never tried to connect it to the concrete concepts he was learning in school. I think your mom became something beautiful and different when she went to heaven, Jake said carefully, navigating the treacherous waters between honesty and hope. Just like how a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. So she's still mom, but also something new? Yeah, buddy, I think that's exactly right. Tommy seemed satisfied with this answer, returning his attention to the passing scenery outside the truck window. But Jake could sense there was more on his son's mind, more questions brewing beneath the surface. Dad, Tommy said as they pulled into their driveway, do you think the princess from this morning will have metamorphosis too? Jake turned off the engine and considered the question seriously. I think she might. Tommy, sometimes people need to go through difficult things before they can become who they're meant to be. Like a cocoon? Like a cocoon. Their house was a modest two-story colonial that Jake had inherited from his grandmother 5 years earlier. When he and Emma had first moved in, she'd had grand plans for renovations, knocking out walls, updating the kitchen, turning the attic into a playroom for future children. After Tommy was born, some of those plans had materialized, but many remained as sketches in a notebook that Jake couldn't bring himself to throw away. The evening routine was well established. Homework at the kitchen table while Jake prepared. Dinner, bath time, story time, and lights out by 8:30. It was a schedule born of necessity rather than preference, but it provided structure in a world that had felt chaotic since Emma's death. Tonight, however, Tommy seemed distracted during homework, staring out the window instead of focusing on his math worksheets. Everything okay, buddy? I keep thinking about the princess, Tommy admitted. Do you think she's lonely at the motel? Jake paused in his dinner preparations, struck by his son's empathy. Even in his own grief and confusion, Tommy was worried about a stranger's feelings. Emma would have been proud of the compassion there. Son was developing. She might be a little lonely, Jake said honestly. But sometimes people need to be alone for a while to figure out what comes next in their story. Maybe we could check on her, Tommy suggested with the innocent directness that only children possessed, just to make sure she's okay. The suggestion hung in the air between them, simple and complex at the same time. Jake's rational mind provided all the reasons why checking on Sophia was unnecessary, potentially inappropriate, and definitely outside the boundaries of his carefully controlled life. But there was another voice in his head, one that sounded suspiciously like Emma, asking what harm could come from a simple act of kindness. Maybe we could, Jake heard himself saying, after dinner. Tommy's face lit up with excitement, and Jake realized he just committed himself to a course of action he wasn't entirely sure about. But watching his son's genuine enthusiasm, the first real excitement he'd shown about anything in weeks, felt worth whatever awkwardness might result. They drove to the Pinneview Inn just after 7 o'clock, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. Jake had stopped at the grocery store on the way, buying items he told himself were practical necessities: a bag of sandwiches from the deli counter, some fruit, a few bottles of water. Tommy had insisted on adding a pack of chocolate chip cookies, reasoning that princesses probably liked cookies. Room 127 was on the ground floor, facing the parking lot. Jake knocked gently, Suddenly aware of how strange this must appear, a man and a child showing up unannounced at a motel room occupied by a woman. They'd met that morning. The door opened slowly, and Sophia appeared wearing jeans and a simple sweater that Jake assumed she'd bought somewhere between the diner and the motel. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she'd washed away the remnants of her wedding makeup. She looked younger somehow, more herself, though Jake realized he had no idea who her actual self might be. "Jake? Tommy? What are you doing here?" "We brought you dinner," Tommy announced before Jake could offer a more measured explanation. "And cookies, because Dad said you might be hungry, and I thought you might like cookies because princesses probably like cookies." Sophia's face transformed, the wariness giving way to genuine warmth. "That's incredibly thoughtful of you both. Would you like to come in?" The motel room was exactly what Jake had expected: generic furniture, dated carpet, and the faint smell of industrial cleaning products. But Sophia had somehow made it feel more welcoming in the few hours she'd been there. Her wedding dress hung carefully in the closet, and she'd arranged a few personal items on the small table by the window. "I hope you don't mind us stopping by," Jake said, suddenly feeling foolish for the impulse that had brought them here. "Tommy was worried about you, and I thought ... "I'm glad you came," Sophia interrupted, her sincerity evident. "I've been sitting here trying to figure out what to do next, and the company is exactly what I needed." Tommy immediately made himself at home, settling cross-legged on the carpet and unpacking the grocery bag with ceremonial importance. "We got turkey sandwiches and ham sandwiches and apples and cookies and water. Dad said you might not have had time to eat today." "Your dad was absolutely right," Sophia said, sitting on the floor beside Tommy with an ease that surprised Jake. "I haven't eaten anything since breakfast, and that was just coffee." As they shared the impromptu picnic on the motel room floor, Jake found himself studying the interaction between Sophia and his son. There was something natural about the way she related to Tommy, not the forced cheerfulness that many adults adopted when talking to children, but genuine interest and respect for his thoughts and observations. "Mrs. Rodriguez taught us about metamorphosis today," Tommy told Sophia seriously. "And I told her about what you said about people changing too. She said you were very smart." "Mrs. Rodriguez sounds like a wise teacher," Sophia replied. "What else did you learn?" "That butterflies remember being caterpillars even after they change. Dad says that's like how Mommy is still Mommy, even though she's in heaven now." Jake felt his breath catch, unprepared for Tommy to bring up Emma so directly. In the months since her death, Tommy had rarely mentioned his mother unprompted, and never to strangers. Sophia's response was immediate and gentle. "That sounds exactly right to me. The most important parts of who we are, the parts that love people and make them feel special, those parts never change, even when everything else does." "Do you think she can see me from heaven?" Tommy asked, his 6-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of questions that kept Jake awake at night. "I think," Sophia said carefully, "that when someone loves you as much as your mom loved you, that love doesn't just disappear. It becomes part of everything around you, the sunshine that warms your face, the wind that plays with your hair, the feeling you get when something makes you really happy. So maybe she's not watching you from far away. Maybe she's part of all the good things that happen to you every day." Jake found himself staring at this woman who had stumbled into their lives by accident, amazed by her ability to offer comfort to his grieving son in ways he'd never thought to try. There was wisdom in her words that came from somewhere deeper than book learning, the kind of understanding that could only come from personal experience with loss and healing. "I like that," Tommy said solemnly. "That means she was there when I met you this morning." "Maybe she was," Sophia agreed, catching Jake's eye over Tommy's head. "Maybe she wanted to make sure you knew that there are still good adventures waiting for you." The conversation continued as they finished their meal, ranging from butterflies to fairy tales to Tommy's plans for his upcoming 7th birthday. Jake found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't since Emma's death, watching his son engage with genuine enthusiasm and seeing glimpses of the boy Tommy had been before grief had muted his natural exuberance. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Jake realized how late it had gotten, well past Tommy's usual bedtime. "We should head home, buddy. It's a school night." Tommy's face fell with disappointment. "Can we visit the princess again tomorrow?" Jake looked at Sophia, unsure how to navigate this request. They'd already imposed on her kindness once today, and he didn't want to assume she'd welcome further intrusion into her crisis. "I'd like that very much," Sophia said, answering Tommy directly, "but I'm not sure how long I'll be staying here. I need to figure out what comes next for me." "What kind of things do you need to figure out?" Tommy asked with characteristic curiosity. Sophia glanced at Jake as if seeking permission. "To be honest." He nodded slightly, trusting her judgment about what was appropriate to share. "Well, I need to find a job and a place to live and maybe some new friends," she said. "I came here from a town about 3 hours away, but I don't think I want to go back there. Sometimes when big changes happen, it's better to start fresh somewhere new." "You could stay here," Tommy suggested with the simple logic of childhood. "Cedar Falls is a good place. Dad says it's small enough that everyone knows everyone, but big enough that you can find everything you need." "Tommy," Jake said gently, recognizing the signs that his son was becoming emotionally invested in outcomes beyond his control. "But Dad, she doesn't have anywhere else to go, and we have the extra bedroom upstairs, and you're always saying Mom would want us to help people." "Who need help?" The silence that followed Tommy's declaration stretched uncomfortably long. Jake felt caught between his son's generous heart and the reality of their situation. They barely knew this woman. Inviting her to stay in their home would be impulsive, at best, reckless at worst. But as he looked at Sophia, at the vulnerability in her expression, the careful way she was trying not to let hope show on her face, Jake felt something shift inside him. For months, he'd been focused on maintaining stability for Tommy, on keeping their small world safe and predictable. But maybe what Tommy needed wasn't protection from change. Maybe what he needed was to see that good things could still happen, that people could still help each other, that their family story wasn't finished just because Emma was gone. "The offer is very kind, Tommy," Sophia said carefully. "But your dad and I would need to talk about something like that. Big decisions like where people live require lots of thinking and planning." Jake appreciated her diplomacy, the way she honored Tommy's suggestion without putting pressure on anyone. It was another sign of the wisdom and consideration that seemed to come naturally to her. "We should definitely talk," Jake heard himself saying, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. "Not tonight, but soon. Tommy's right that we have the space, and you're right that big decisions need careful thought." The drive home was quieter than usual, Tommy's excitement about the evening's adventure warring with his exhaustion. By the time they reached their driveway, he was nearly asleep in his booster seat. "Dad," he said sleepily as Jake carried him upstairs to his bedroom, "I think the princess is going to have a good metamorphosis." "Yeah, buddy," Jake replied, tucking Tommy under his covers. "I think you might be right." After Tommy was asleep, Jake found himself pacing the kitchen, replaying the events of the day and trying to understand what was happening to his carefully ordered life. 12 hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether to add overtime hours to his work schedule. Now he was contemplating inviting a virtual stranger to live in his home. And the most surprising part was that the idea didn't terrify him the way it should have. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Thank you for tonight. Tommy's lucky to have you as a father." "Sophia," Jake stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Tommy thinks you're going to have a good metamorphosis. He's usually right about these things." The reply came quickly. "I hope he is. Good night, Jake." As Jake turned off the lights and headed upstairs to his own bedroom, He felt something he hadn't experienced in months, anticipation about what tomorrow might bring. For the first time since Emma's death, the future felt like something more than just an endless series of days to survive. It felt like a possibility. The next morning arrived with an unexpected phone call at 6:15, jarring Jake from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. He fumbled for his phone, immediately alert with the panic that any parent knows early morning calls meant emergencies. "Jake, this is Sophia. I'm so sorry to call this early, but I didn't know who else to contact." Her voice carried a tension that made Jake sit up straighter in bed. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but there's been a complication. The motel manager just informed me that they're fully booked for tonight and the rest of the week. Some kind of regional conference that was booked months ago. He's giving me until 11 to check out." Jake swung his legs over the side of the bed, already calculating logistics. "What about other motels in the area? I've called everywhere within 20 miles. Everything's booked solid because of this conference. The nearest availability is in Grand Rapids, which is almost 2 hours away and more expensive than I can afford right now." Through his bedroom window, Jake could see the first hints of dawn painting the sky a soft gray. In a few hours, he'd need to wake Tommy for school, maintain their morning routine, and somehow figure out how to help Sophia without disrupting the careful balance he'd built for his son's stability. "Have you had breakfast?" he asked, the question emerging from the practical part of his mind that always focused on immediate needs before tackling larger problems. "No, Jake, I don't want to impose on you any more than I already have. You've been incredibly kind, but this isn't your responsibility. Meet us at Mitchell's Diner at 7:30, Jake said, making the decision before his rational mind could interfere. "We'll figure this out together." After hanging up, Jake lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling and wondering when his life had become so complicated. 2 days ago, his biggest challenge was convincing Tommy to eat his vegetables. Now he was involved in the housing crisis of a woman he barely knew, and the strangest part was that it felt right. Tommy was unusually quiet during their morning preparations, sensing the subtle shift in his father's energy without understanding its source. It wasn't until they were driving toward the diner that he finally spoke up. "Is the princess in trouble, Dad?" Jake glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting his son's perceptive green eyes. "She needs to find a new place to stay today. Sometimes, adults have to solve problems that are more complicated than they expect. Like when you had to figure out how to braid my hair for picture day." The memory brought a smile to Jake's face despite his current concerns. He'd spent 45 minutes watching YouTube tutorials that morning, determined to master a skill that Emma had made look effortless. The final result had been functional if not elegant, but Tommy had worn it proudly. "Something like that, buddy." Sophia was already waiting in their usual booth when they arrived, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug as if it were an anchor. She'd changed clothes again, a simple blue dress that brought out the storm cloud color of her eyes, and her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked composed, but Jake could see the underlying stress in the tight line of her jaw. "Good morning, Princess," Tommy called out as they approached the table, his enthusiasm cutting through the morning's tension like sunshine through clouds. "Good morning, Tommy," Sophia replied, her smile genuine despite her circumstances. "How did you sleep?" "I dreamed about butterflies," Tommy announced, sliding into the booth beside her. They were all different colors, and they could talk. One of them said she used to be afraid of flying, but then she remembered that she was born to do it. Jake felt something tighten in his chest at his son's unconscious wisdom. "Out of the mouths of babes," Emma used to say whenever Tommy said something unexpectedly profound. "That sounds like a very wise butterfly," Sophia said seriously. "Sometimes the things we're most afraid of are exactly the things we need to do to become who we're meant to be." Marge appeared with coffee for Jake and chocolate milk for Tommy. her experienced waitress instincts reading the table's mood with practiced accuracy. "You folks look like you're having a serious morning conversation. The princess needs a new place to stay," Tommy explained with his characteristic directness. "All the motels are full." "Conference week," Marge nodded knowingly. "Happens every October. Brings money to the town, but it's a pain for anyone who needs a room. You might try looking in Millfield. It's about 40 minutes south." Jake saw Sophia's shoulders tense at the suggestion. 40 minutes might as well be 400. For someone with limited funds and no transportation. "Actually," Jake said, the words forming before he'd fully thought them through, "we might have a solution." Both Sophia and Tommy turned to look at him with identical expressions of hopeful curiosity. Jake felt the weight of the moment, understanding that what he said next would change everything for all of them. "Tommy mentioned yesterday that we have an extra bedroom upstairs. It's nothing fancy, just my old office that I converted when we moved in, but it has a bed and a window and privacy. If you're interested, you could stay with us until you figure out your next steps." The silence that followed felt enormous. Jake could hear the coffee machine hissing behind the counter, the distant sound of traffic on Route 47, and the rhythmic ticking of the ancient wall clock above the cash register. "Dad, really?" Tommy's voice was filled with excitement barely contained. "She can stay with us?" "Only if she wants to," Jake said carefully, watching Sophia's face for any sign of her thoughts. "It would be temporary, just until you get settled. No strings attached, no pressure, just one person helping another." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but they seemed different from the grief-stricken tears she'd cried the day before. These carried relief and gratitude and something that might have been hope. "I can't accept that," she said softly. "It's too much. You barely know me." "We know enough," Jake replied, surprising himself with his certainty. "We know you're kind to children. We know you have the courage to walk away from a bad situation. We know you're grateful for help when it's offered. That's more than I knew about most of my neighbors when I moved back here. And we know you like cookies," Tommy added seriously, as if this were the most important qualification of all. Sophia laughed then, a sound that seemed to release some of the tension that had been building around the table. "You make a compelling argument, both of you. Think about it," Jake said. "No decision has to be made right this minute, but the offer is genuine." They ordered breakfast and the conversation gradually shifted to lighter topics. Tommy's upcoming school project on community helpers, Sophia's background in graphic design, Jake's plans for winterizing the house. But underneath the casual chat, Jake could sense Sophia processing the offer, weighing her limited options against the risk of accepting help from people she'd known for less than 24 hours. It was Tommy who ultimately tipped the scales. "Sophia," he said as they finished eating, his voice carrying the serious tone he used for important declarations, "I think Mom would like you. She always said the best people are the ones who are kind to strangers and brave when things are scary. You're both of those things." Jake felt his breath catch. Tommy rarely invoked Emma's memory in conversations with other people, and never to justify or explain his feelings. That he'd done so now with such confidence and clarity suggested something significant was happening in his young mind. Sophia reached over and took Tommy's small hand in hers. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me. If your mom was the kind of person who raised such a thoughtful, generous boy, then I would have been honored to know her. So you'll stay?" Tommy asked hopefully. Sophia looked across the table at Jake, her expression vulnerable but determined. "Are you absolutely sure about this? Because once I say yes, it becomes real, and I don't want you to regret it later." Jake considered the question seriously. Was he sure? Logically, no. This was impulsive, potentially complicated, and definitely outside his comfort zone. But when he looked at Tommy's hopeful face and Sophia's grateful eyes, When he thought about the way she'd helped his son process grief, through butterfly metaphors and fairy tale wisdom, certainty felt less important than courage, unsure. He said simply, the drive to the Pinneview Inn to collect Sophia's belongings felt ceremonial, like crossing a threshold into unknown territory. Tommy chartered excitedly from his booster seat, planning all the things he wanted to show Sophia in their house, his room, the backyard for he and Emma had built the previous summer, the kitchen window where birds came to feed every morning. We have a rule about the TV, he explained seriously. Educational shows on weekdays, cartoons on weekends, and movies on Friday nights if I finish all my homework. That sounds like a very reasonable rule, Sophia agreed. What kind of movies do you like? Adventure movies mostly. Dad says I'm not old enough for scary movies yet, but I can watch ones where good guys fight bad guys and everyone learns important lessons. Jake found himself smiling at his son's description of their household policies. Through Tommy's eyes, their life sounded stable and intentional rather than cobbled together from necessity and grief. Sophia's belongings fit easily into 2 suitcases and a garment bag containing her wedding dress. As Jake loaded them into his truck, he noticed she moved carefully around the dress, as if it might bite her. What are you going to do with it? He asked gently. I'm not sure yet, she admitted. Part of me wants to burn it in a ceremonial bonfire. But it costs $3,000 and it seems wasteful. Maybe I'll donate it to one of those organizations that provides dresses for brides who can't afford them. That's a beautiful idea, Jake said, and meant it. Even in her pain, Sophia was thinking about how to help others. It was another sign of the character that had drawn him to offer help in the first place. The house tour took nearly an hour, with Tommy serving as an enthusiastic guide who felt compelled to share the story behind every family photo, piece of furniture, and childhood artwork displayed on the refrigerator. Sophia listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made Tommy feel important and heard. This is Mom's garden, Tommy announced as they stood in the backyard, pointing to a raised bed that had been Emma's pride and joy. Dad keeps it going, but he says he's not as good at it as she was. The tomatoes didn't grow right this year. Jake felt the familiar pang of inadequacy that accompanied any mention of his failures to maintain Emma's projects. He'd tried to keep the garden thriving, but his construction worker hands seemed too rough for the delicate work of nurturing growing things. Gardens can be tricky, Sophia said thoughtfully, kneeling beside the raised bed and examining the soil. Sometimes they need a season to rest and figure out what they want to become. It doesn't mean the gardener did anything wrong. Do you know about gardens? Tommy asked hopefully. A little. My grandmother taught me some things when I was about your age. We grew vegetables and herbs and flowers that attract butterflies. She smiled at the memory. She used to say that a garden is really just a way of having conversations with the earth. Could you teach me? Tommy asked, his voice filled with the eager curiosity that Jake hadn't heard in months. I'd love to, Sophia replied. Though we'll have to wait until spring for most planting. Winter is more about planning and preparing. As they headed back inside, Jake caught himself imagining Sophia kneeling in Emma's garden come springtime. Her hands dark with soil as she taught Tommy the secrets his mother hadn't lived long enough to share. The image should have felt like a betrayal of Emma's memory, but instead it felt like a gift, a way for life to continue growing in places where it had been cut short. The spare bedroom was on the 2nd floor, across the hall from Tommy's room, and down the hallway from Jake's. It was small but comfortable, with a double bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over the backyard. Emma had helped him set it up as a home office when they'd first moved in, but he'd rarely used it, preferring to work at the kitchen table where he could keep an eye on Tommy. It's perfect, Sophia said, setting her suitcase on the bed and looking around the space that would be her sanctuary. Thank you, Jake. I know I keep saying it, but I need you to understand how much this means to me. You don't have to keep thanking me, Jake replied. This is what people do for each other. No, Sophia said firmly. This is what good people do for each other. There's a difference. That evening, their usual routine expanded to accommodate a third person, and Jake was struck by how naturally Sophia fit into the rhythm of their household. She helped Tommy with his homework, asking thoughtful questions about his math problems, and listening patiently as he read aloud from his library book. She insisted on helping with dinner preparation, revealing a competence in the kitchen that made Jake realize how much he'd been struggling with the domestic duties that Emma had managed so effortlessly. I should probably explain about my situation, Sophia said as they cleaned up after dinner, Tommy occupied with building an elaborate fort in the living room. I mean beyond the obvious drama of yesterday morning. Jake handed her a dish towel, noting the way she moved around his kitchen as if she belonged there. Only if you want to. I want to be honest with you, especially since you're letting me stay here. She leaned against the counter, organizing her thoughts. Richard and I lived together for 2 years before we got engaged. I was working as a freelance graphic designer, mostly doing websites and marketing materials for small businesses. When we started planning the wedding, I cut back on work to focus on all the details. Richard said we could afford it, that his salary could cover our expenses. Jake sensed there was more to the story, complications that went beyond wedding planning. After we got engaged, he started making comments about my work. Little things at first suggesting that maybe I should focus on finding clients who paid better, or that perhaps I wasn't charging enough because I didn't value my own skills. Then he started criticizing specific projects, saying they weren't professional enough or that I was wasting time on hobby work, controlling behavior. Jake said quietly, recognizing patterns he'd heard about from his sister's own difficult marriage years earlier. Exactly, though I didn't see it that way at the time. I thought he was trying to help me succeed. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd lost most of my regular clients and my confidence was shot. I became financially dependent on him, which I think was the point. She folded the dish towel carefully, her movements precise and controlled. So when I left yesterday, I didn't just walk away from a wedding. I walked away from my apartment, my income, and pretty much everything I built my adult life around. I have some savings, but not enough to start over in an expensive city. Jake felt a surge of anger toward the man who had systematically undermined this intelligent, capable woman's sense of her own worth. What kind of graphic design work do you want to do? The question seemed to surprise her. I'm not sure. Anyone's asked me that in a long time. I love working with nonprofits and small businesses, helping them tell their stories visually. There's something satisfying about taking someone's passion project and figuring out how to make it connect with people. Cedar Falls has a lot of small businesses, Jake said thoughtfully. And the Chamber of Commerce is always talking about the need for better marketing and web presence. Have you thought about starting over here? Sophia's eyes widened as if the possibility hadn't occurred to her. I suppose I assumed I'd need to go back to a bigger city to find work. Maybe, Jake agreed, but maybe not. Sometimes the best opportunities are in places where there's less competition and more need. From the living room came the sound of Tommy's voice, talking to himself as he arranged furniture for his fort. The princess can live in the castle tower, and the dragon can guard the treasure, but they have to be friends because fighting is not the way to solve problems. Jake and Sophia exchanged amused glances, both charmed by Tommy's 6-year-old approach to conflict resolution. He's remarkable, Sophia said softly. You should be proud of the job you're doing with him. Most days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water, Jake admitted. Emma was the one who was good with the emotional stuff, the conversations about feelings and fears. I can handle scraped knees and bedtime stories, but when he asks me questions about life and death, and why bad things happen to good people, I'm lost. But you're not lost, Sophia said with conviction. You're honest with him about what you Don't know, and you're present for him even when things are difficult. That's not failing, Jake. That's exactly what he needs. As they finished cleaning the kitchen, Jake found himself thinking about Emma and wondering what she would make of the current situation. Would she approve of him bringing a stranger into their home? Would she understand his growing attraction to this woman who had appeared in their lives so unexpectedly? The answer came to him with surprising clarity. Emma would have invited Sophia to stay before Jake had even thought of it. His wife had always been drawn to wounded birds and lost causes, always ready to offer help to anyone who needed it. In opening his home to Sophia, Jake wasn't betraying Emma's memory, he was honoring it. "Jake," Sophia's voice interrupted his reverie. "Thank you for giving me a chance to figure out what comes next. I promise I won't take advantage of your kindness." "I know you won't," Jake replied, and realized he meant it completely. Later that night, after Tommy was tucked into bed and Sophia had retreated to her room, Jake stood in his kitchen and listened to the sounds of his house. There were new sounds. Now the creak of floorboards in the guest room, the murmur of water running through unfamiliar pipes, the soft sound of someone moving carefully through space that wasn't quite home yet. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility. 3 weeks into their new living arrangement, Jake discovered Sophia in the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, hunched over her laptop with dark circles under her eyes and an empty coffee mug beside her. The soft glow of the screen illuminated her face as her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, completely absorbed in whatever project had kept her awake through the night. "Morning," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up with a guilty expression, as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. I was trying to be quiet. You didn't wake me. I always get up early." Jake moved to the coffee maker, beginning his own morning ritual. "What are you working on?" "A website design for Henderson's Hardware." Bill Henderson, you know, the older gentleman from the diner, it turns out he owns the hardware store on Main Street. He mentioned that his grandson keeps telling him he needs a web presence, but he doesn't know where to start. Jake remembered Bill from their morning encounters at Mitchell's Diner, though he'd never connected him to the family business that had been serving Cedar Falls for 3 generations. "How did that conversation happen?" Sophia stretched, working out a crick in her neck from hours of hunching over the computer. "I was walking downtown yesterday while Tommy was at school, just exploring the area, and I stopped in to buy some organizational supplies for my room. We started talking, and one thing led to another. He showed me the old ledgers where his father used to track inventory by hand, and these amazing photographs of the store from the 1940s. There's so much history there, so much character." She turned the laptop screen toward Jake, revealing a website mock-up that captured exactly what she was describing. The design somehow managed to feel both modern and nostalgic, with vintage photographs integrated seamlessly alongside current product information and a clean, intuitive navigation system. "This is incredible," Jake said, genuinely impressed. The website looked professional enough to compete with major retailers, yet maintained the personal touch that made small-town businesses special. "You think so?" "I've been second-guessing myself all night. It's been so long since I created something from scratch, something that was entirely my vision rather than what someone else told me they wanted." Jake heard the insecurity in her voice, the lingering effects of months of having her creative judgment undermined. "Sophia, this is exactly the kind of thing Bill needs. You've captured everything that makes his store special while making it accessible to people who might never have thought to shop there." "He's paying me," she said with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "Not a lot, but it's the first money I've earned since everything fell apart. And he said if the website works out, he might recommend me to other business owners in town." The kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh coffee as Jake processed this development. In the weeks since Sophia had moved in, She'd thrown herself into helping with household tasks and spending time with Tommy, but he'd sensed she was struggling with questions about her professional future. This project seemed to have rekindled something vital in her. "There's more," she said, her voice gaining excitement. "Yesterday afternoon, I stopped by the community center to see if they had any bulletin boards where I could post a flyer about graphic design services. The director, Mrs. Patterson, was there dealing with some crisis about their newsletter. Their volunteer who usually handles it just moved away, and they were looking at having to hire a print-in company to do basic layout work they can't afford." Jake could see where this was heading, and it made something warm unfurl in his chest. "Let me guess you volunteered." "I offered to help with this month's newsletter, just to see if we could work together. It's not paid work, but it would give me local samples to show potential clients." And Mrs. Patterson mentioned that several of the nonprofits in town have the same problem. They need design work, but don't have the budgets for big agencies. "That sounds like an opportunity." "It sounds like the beginning of something," Sophia corrected, her eyes bright with possibility. "I've been thinking about what you said that first night, about small towns having different opportunities than big cities. Maybe there's a way to build something here that I couldn't build anywhere else." The sound of small feet on the stairs announced Tommy's arrival, interrupting their conversation, but not diminishing. Jake sensed that something significant was shifting in their household dynamics. Sophia was no longer just a temporary guest recovering from crisis. She was becoming a person with plans, with roots beginning to grow in Cedar Falls soil. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Sophia called out as Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair sticking up at impossible angles and his dinosaur pajamas twisted from sleep. "Morning, Sophia. Morning, Dad." Tommy climbed onto his usual chair at the kitchen table, still blinking away the last traces of sleep. "Are you making pancakes today?" "It's Thursday, and Thursday is pancake day." Jake exchanged a glance with Sophia, both of them recognizing the way Tommy had unconsciously included her in his expectations about household routines. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd gradually become woven into the fabric of their daily life in ways that felt both natural and profound. "I think pancakes sound perfect," Sophia said, already moving toward the refrigerator. "And I have a surprise for you, Tommy. I finished the illustrations for your school project last night." Tommy's face lit up with excitement. For the past week, he'd been working on a presentation about community helpers, and Sophia had offered to create custom illustrations to accompany his research. It was the kind of professional quality work that would typically cost hundreds of dollars, but she'd insisted it was her contribution to his education. "Can I see them? Can I see them? Now?" Tommy bounced in his chair with anticipation. Sophia retrieved a folder from the counter and spread out a series of detailed illustrations, showing various community workers and action firefighters, police officers, teachers, doctors, and construction workers. Each drawing was rendered in a style that was sophisticated yet accessible to a 6-year-old audience, with careful attention to detail that made each profession look both heroic and approachable. "Whoa," Tommy breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. "These are amazing. Look, Dad, this construction worker looks just like you." Jake examined the illustration more closely and realized that Sophia had indeed used him as a model for the construction worker figure. The drawing captured not just his physical appearance but something of his character, the careful attention he paid to his work, the pride he took in building things that would last. "You drew this from memory?" he asked, impressed by the accuracy of details he hadn't even realized she'd noticed. "I'm good at observing people," Sophia said, with a slight blush. "It's part of what makes me effective at design work. I pay attention to the details that make each person or business unique." As they prepared breakfast together, Jake found himself watching the easy rhythm that had developed between Sophia and Tommy. She seemed to understand intuitively how to engage with his 6-year-old energy, when to encourage his enthusiasm, and when to redirect it when to listen seriously to his ideas, and when to gently guide him toward more practical solutions. "Tommy," she said as she flipped pancakes, "I have a question for you. How would you feel about helping me with something this weekend?" "What kind of something?" Tommy asked, always eager for new adventures. "Well, I'm going to be photographing some of the local businesses for their websites, and I thought you might like to be my assistant. You could help me carry equipment and maybe even take some pictures of your own." Tommy's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? I could be like a real photographer?" "A real photographer's assistant," Sophia corrected gently, "which is a very important job. The best photographers always have good assistants." Jake felt a complex mix of emotions as he watched this exchange. There was gratitude for the way Sophia naturally included Tommy in her plans, but also something deeper, a recognition that she wasn't just being kind to his son out of obligation or politeness. She genuinely enjoyed Tommy's company and seemed to find real value in his perspectives and ideas. After breakfast, as they went through their morning routine of preparing for school and work, Jake noticed how seamlessly their schedules had synchronized. Sophia had learned Tommy's preferred breakfast routine, the exact temperature he liked his bathwater, and the specific way he needed his backpack organized for school. These weren't grand gestures, but small acts of attention that spoke to her. Growing investment in their family's well-being. "Dad," Tommy said as Jake buckled him into his booster seat for the drive to school, "do you think Sophia is going to stay with us forever?" The question caught Jack off guard, forcing him to confront feelings he'd been carefully avoiding examining too closely. "I don't know, buddy. That would be up to her." "Why do you ask?" "Because it feels like she belongs here," Tommy said with the simple clarity that only children possessed. "Like she's supposed to be part of our family." Jake's hands stilled on the seatbelt buckle as he processed his son's words. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd been telling himself that their arrangement was temporary, a short-term solution to Sophia's housing crisis. But Tommy's observation forced him to acknowledge what he'd been feeling, but not naming that. Sophia's presence in their home had filled spaces he hadn't even realized were empty. "Sometimes people come into our lives when we need them most," Jake said carefully, "but that doesn't always mean they stay forever. Sometimes the best thing we can do is enjoy the time we have with them and be grateful for how they help us grow, like Mom did." Tommy asked quietly. The comparison stopped Jake's breath. He'd never thought about Emma's role in their lives in quite those terms, but Tommy's insight was profound. Emma had come into Jake's life when he needed her most, had helped him become the man and father he was meant to be, and even though her time with them had been cut short, the impact of her love continued to shape them every day. "Yeah, buddy," Jake said softly, "like Mom did." The conversation stayed with Jake throughout the morning as he worked on the construction site. During his lunch break, he found himself thinking about the changes that had occurred in their household since Sophia's arrival. Tommy was more animated, more willing to talk about his feelings and ask difficult questions. Jake himself felt less isolated, less burdened by the weight of single parenthood. Even practical matters seemed easier with an extra pair of hands and another adult perspective. But beyond the practical benefits, there was something else happening that Jake was only beginning to acknowledge. Somewhere between Sophia's first night in their guest room and this morning's kitchen conversation about her growing business prospects, his feelings toward her had evolved from protective concern to something much more complex and personal. Was attracted to her, certainly, her intelligence, her resilience, her gentle strength with Tommy, but it was more than physical attraction. He found himself looking forward to their conversations, curious about her opinions on everything from Tommy's homework to local politics. He admired her work ethic, her determination to rebuild her professional life from scratch. He was impressed by her emotional intelligence, the way she seemed to understand both his and Tommy's needs, sometimes better than they understood them themselves. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. After Emma's death, Jake had assumed that part of his life was over, that his capacity for romantic love had been buried alongside his wife. The idea that he might be capable of those feelings again felt like both a gift and a betrayal. His phone buzzed with a text message that interrupted his complicated thoughts. Tommy's school called. He's fine, but the nurse wants to check him for fever. Can you pick him up early? I'm in a client meeting but can meet you at home. Sophia. The casual efficiency of her message struck Jake as remarkably domestic. She'd handled the school call, made the practical arrangements, and communicated the plan without drama or confusion. It was exactly what a partner would do, what Emma used to do during the years when they'd shared parenting responsibilities. Jake packed up his tools and headed to Oakwood Elementary, arriving to find Tommy in the nurse's office looking slightly pale but alert. His temperature was just slightly elevated, not enough to warrant serious concern, but sufficient to justify keeping him home for the afternoon. I don't feel sick, Tommy protested as Jake signed the early dismissal forms. My tummy feels funny, but not like throw-up funny. More exciting and funny. Jake recognized the distinction. Tommy had developed a sophisticated vocabulary for describing his physical and emotional states, a skill that had emerged partly from necessity as he'd learned to articulate his grief and partly from the encouragement of adults who took his feelings seriously. Maybe you're excited about something coming up? Jake suggested as they walked to the truck. Maybe about helping Sophia take pictures this weekend, Tommy agreed. Or maybe about showing Mrs. Rodriguez my illustrations tomorrow. Or maybe about the pizza party next week for kids who read 20 books. As they drove home, Jake reflected on how different the scenario would have been 6 months earlier. Then, an early pickup from school would have meant rearranging his work schedule, finding emergency childcare, and managing his own anxiety about whether he was handling the situation correctly. Now it felt manageable because he knew Sophia would be there to help assess Tommy's condition and make decisions about next steps. They arrived home to find Sophia's car already in the driveway and the smell of chicken soup wafting from the kitchen. She'd left her client meeting early to prepare comfort food, anticipating Tommy's needs before anyone had asked her to do so. How's our patient? She called out as they entered through the back door. I'm not really sick, Tommy announced. I just have an excited tummy. Sophia knelt down to Tommy's eye level, pressing the back of her hand against his forehead, with the practiced motion of someone who understood the parental ritual of fever checking. Well, excited tummy or not, I think some soup and quiet time might be just what you need. And I have something that might help you feel even better. She led them to the living room, where she'd arranged a cozy setup with blankets, pillows, and Tommy's favorite stuffed animals. On the coffee table sat a new sketchbook and a set of colored pencils, along with a handwritten note. What does it say? Tommy asked, settling into the blanket nest with obvious pleasure. Sophia picked up the note and read aloud. For Tommy, my favorite artist and photographer's assistant. Sometimes when our bodies need to rest, our creativity wants to play. Use this book to draw anything that makes you happy. Love, Sophia. Jake felt something profound shift in his chest as he watched Tommy's face light up with delight. The gift was perfect, thoughtful without being excessive, encouraging Tommy's artistic interests while acknowledging his current need for quiet activity. But it was the signature that stopped Jake's breath. Love, Sophia. Not from Sophia or your friend Sophia, but love. Thank you, Sophia. Tommy threw his arms around her neck with the uninhibited affection that came naturally to him. This is the best sick day present ever, even though I'm not really sick. You're very welcome, sweetheart, Sophia replied, her voice soft with emotion. As Jake watched them together, Sophia helping Tommy arrange his art supplies while he chatted about all the things he wanted to draw, he realized that whatever was happening between the three of them had moved far beyond temporary arrangements and charitable assistance. They were becoming something that looked very much like a family, and for the first time since Emma's death, that possibility didn't fill him with guilt or fear. It filled him with hope. That evening, after Tommy had fallen asleep on the living room couch clutching his new sketchbook, Jake and Sophia found themselves cleaning up the kitchen in comfortable silence. The domestic routine had become so natural that they moved around each other efficiently, each anticipating the other's needs and movements. "Thank you," Jake said as they finished wiping down the counters. "For leaving your meeting, for the soup, for the sketchbook, for everything." "You don't need to thank me," Sophia replied, hanging up the dish towel with careful precision. "Taking care of Tommy when he doesn't feel well, that's not a favor I'm doing for you. That's just what you do for people you care about." The honesty in her voice made Jake turn to face her fully. In the soft light of the kitchen, with her hair slightly mussed from the day's activities and her eyes warm with affection for his son, she looked beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional standards and everything to do with the goodness that radiated from within. "Sophia," he said, her name feeling significant on his tongue. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you signed that note to Tommy, when you wrote 'Love, Sophia,' did you mean it?" She was quiet for so long that Jake began to worry he'd overstepped, pushed too hard into emotional territory that was still too fragile to examine. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steady and sure. "I meant it completely," she said. "I love that little boy like he was my own. I know that probably sounds crazy, given how short a time I've known him, but Tommy has become one of the most important people in my life. And what about his father?" Jake asked quietly, taking a step closer to her. "How do you feel about him?" Sophia's eyes searched his face, as if looking for confirmation that this conversation was really happening, that they were finally acknowledging the feelings that had been building between them for weeks. "His father," she said slowly, "has become pretty important to me too." The admission hung between them in the quiet kitchen, charged with possibility and vulnerability. Jake felt his heart racing as he processed Sophia's words, the careful way she'd answered his question without fully revealing the depth of her feelings. He was about to respond when the sound of Tommy stirring on the living room couch broke. "The moment, Dad, Sophia?" "I had a weird dream," came Tommy's sleepy voice from the other room. Thought they moved apart instinctively, the spell of intimacy broken by parental responsibility. But as they walked into the living room together, Jake felt something had fundamentally shifted between them. The conversation was far from over, it was just beginning. Tommy was sitting up on the couch, his hair tousled and his new sketchbook clutched against his chest. "I dreamed that Mom was teaching butterflies how to paint pictures, and they were making a giant mural on the clouds." Sophia knelt beside the couch, her voice gentle. "That sounds like a beautiful dream. What kind of pictures were they painting?" "Happy pictures," Tommy said seriously. "Pictures of families and gardens and houses with people laughing inside them. Mom said the butterflies needed to practice making beautiful things, because that's how they help people feel better when they're sad." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. Tommy's dreams about Emma had become less frequent over the months. But when they occurred, they often carried profound messages that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his 6-year-old understanding. "I think your mom was right about that," Sophia said softly. "Beautiful things do help people feel better. That's why art and music and stories are so important." "She said something else too," Tommy continued, his voice growing quieter. "She said that sometimes when people love each other, they can see the same beautiful pictures even when they're apart. Like how I can see her smile even though she's in heaven." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, and Jake saw her struggle to maintain her composure. "Your mom sounds very wise, Tommy." "She is," Tommy said with absolute certainty. "And she said to tell you both thank you." "Thank you for what?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tommy looked at him with the serious expression he wore when conveying important information. for taking care of each other. She said families are like butterflies, they need time to grow their wings, but once they learn how to fly together, they can create the most beautiful pictures in the world. The silence that followed was profound. Jake felt as if Tommy had somehow articulated truths that he and Sophia had been dancing around for weeks, using the innocent clarity of childhood to cut through adult complications and fears. "I think I'm ready to go to sleep in my real bed now," Tommy announced, the moment of profound insight giving way to practical 6-year-old concerns. "But can someone tuck me in extra tight? Sometimes after butterfly dreams, I need extra hugs." Jake and Sophia took turns tucking Tommy into his bed, both of them lingering longer than usual, both seeming reluctant to leave the safety of bedtime routines for the complexity of adult conversations waiting downstairs. But eventually, Tommy's breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep, and they found themselves back in the kitchen, the weight of unfinished discussions settling around them. "Coffee?" Sophia asked, though it was nearly 9 o'clock and caffeine was probably the last thing either of them needed. "Sure," Jake replied, understanding that the offer was really about creating a reason to stay in the same room, to continue talking without the pressure of facing each other directly. As Sophia busied herself with the coffee maker, Jake found himself studying her profile in the soft kitchen light. Over the past month, he'd memorized the details of her face, the way her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled, the small scar on her chin from a childhood bicycle accident, the graceful line of her neck when she bent her head in concentration. "Jake," she said without turning around, "what Tommy just said ... about families learning to fly together ... Do you think he understands what's happening between us?" "I think Tommy understands things that adults spend years trying to figure out," Jake replied honestly. "He sees with his heart instead of his head, which makes him wiser than most people." Sophia turned to face him then, her expression vulnerable, but determined. "Then maybe we should try seeing with our hearts too, instead of overthinking everything." Jake took a step toward her, drawn by the courage in her voice and the invitation in her eyes. "And what does your heart see when you look at this situation?" "It sees a man who opened his home to a stranger because it was the right thing to do," she said softly. "A father who puts his son's needs above his own comfort every single day. Someone who makes me feel safe and valued and beautiful in ways I'd forgotten were possible." Jake's breath caught. "Sophia, it sees a little boy who needed a mother figure even though he'd never admit it," she continued, "and somehow decided that I might be worthy of that role. It sees a house that feels more like home than anywhere I've ever lived, and a life I want to be part of, not because I need rescuing, but because I want to contribute to something meaningful." The coffee maker finished its cycle with a soft beep, but neither of them moved to pour cups. Jake felt suspended in the moment, acutely aware that whatever he said next would determine the direction of all their futures. "My heart sees something similar," he said finally. "It sees a woman who walked into our lives at exactly the moment we needed her most. Someone who makes Tommy laugh and helps him process his grief in ways I never could. Someone who makes me remember what it feels like to share the weight of parenthood with a partner." He moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of blue in her gray eyes. "It sees someone I could fall in love with, if I haven't already started to." The admission terrified him even as he spoke it. After Emma's death, he'd assumed that chapter of his life was closed, that his capacity for romantic love had been buried with his wife. But Sophia had quietly, gradually proved him wrong. "Jake," Sophia whispered, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. "I think I started falling in love with you the morning I met you, when you got angry on behalf of a woman you didn't even know. It just took me a while to understand what was happening." They stood there for a moment, hands touching, breathing the same air, both of them trembling slightly with the enormity of what they were acknowledging. Then Jake leaned down and kissed her, softly at first, then with growing certainty as she responded. The kiss was everything Jake hadn't known he'd been missing, gentle but passionate, familiar yet thrilling, full of promise and possibility. When they finally separated, both of them were breathing heavily. "This changes everything," Sophia said, her voice filled with wonder rather than fear. "Yeah," Jake agreed. "Is that okay?" "It's more than okay," she replied, smiling with a radiance that transformed her entire face. "It's perfect." They talked until nearly midnight, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears about the future. Jake told her about his marriage to Emma, the guilt he'd carried about moving on, his concerns about how Tommy would react to seeing his father with someone new. Sophia spoke about her years with Richard, the slow erosion of her self-confidence, her amazement at discovering that love could feel safe and encouraging rather than diminishing. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she admitted as they finally prepared to go upstairs. "For you to realize that this is all too complicated, that taking on someone with as much baggage as I have isn't worth it." Jake took her hands in his, wanting her to see the sincerity in his eyes. "Sophia, everyone has baggage. The question isn't whether you have difficult experiences in your past. It's what you've learned from them, and how they've shaped you into the person you are now. And the person you are now is someone I admire, someone I respect, someone I want to build a future with." "What about Tommy?" she asked. "I love him desperately, but I'm not his mother. I don't want to try to replace Emma or confuse him about his family structure." "You're not replacing Emma," Jake said firmly. "You're adding to our family in a way that honors her memory. Emma would want Tommy to have as many people as possible who love him unconditionally. She'd want me to find happiness again. And she'd absolutely adore you." The next morning brought new challenges and new joys. Tommy woke up feeling completely recovered from his mild illness, full of energy and excited about the weekend photography project with Sophia. Over breakfast, Jake and Sophia exchanged glances loaded with newfound intimacy, both of them hyper-aware of the changed dynamic between them. "You two look different today," Tommy observed with his characteristic perceptiveness. "Like you have a secret that makes you happy." Jake and Sophia exchanged another look, this one tinged with amusement and slight panic. They hadn't discussed how or when to tell Tommy about their evolving relationship, and his direct observation forced the issue sooner than expected. "We do have something we'd like to talk to you about," Sophia said gently. "Your dad and I have realized that we care about each other in a very special way." Tommy looked back and forth between them, processing this information with 6-year-old logic. "You mean like how Mom and Dad used to care about each other?" "Similar to that," Jake said carefully. "But different too, because every relationship is unique. What we want you to know is that nothing about how much we love you will ever change. You'll always be the most important person in my life, and Sophia feels the same way." "Will Sophia be my new mom?" Tommy asked with genuine curiosity rather than distress. "Sophia will always be Sophia," Jake replied. "She never tried to replace your mom because no one could do that. But she might become someone very special in our family if that feels right to all of us." Tommy considered this seriously, his small face scrunched in concentration. "Will she stay here forever now?" "We don't know yet what forever looks like," Sophia said honestly. "But we know that we want to be together, and we hope that makes you happy." Tommy's face broke into a wide grin. "It makes me super happy. I told Mrs. Rodriguez that I thought you might be my new family member, and she said sometimes the best families are the ones that choose each other." Jake felt his heart swell with pride and relief. Tommy's acceptance meant everything, but more than that, his wisdom continued to amaze. At 6 years old, he understood concepts about love and family that some adults never grasped. The weekend photography expedition became a celebration of sorts, though none of them explicitly acknowledged it as such. They visited 5 local businesses, with Tommy serving as an enthusiastic assistant who charmed business owners and provided creative input on photo compositions. Watching Sophia work, Jake was struck by her professionalism and artistic eye. The way she could capture not just the physical appearance of a business, but its personality and values. At Riverside Books, the independent bookstore downtown, Tommy suggested photographing the owner, Mrs. Kim, reading to the stuffed animals. In the children's section, the resulting images perfectly captured the store's commitment to fostering literacy and imagination. At Peterson's Bakery, he noticed how the late afternoon light streaming through the front windows made the display cases look magical, leading to shots that made every pastry look irresistible. "You're a natural at this," Sophia told Tommy as they packed up equipment after their final shoot at the local veterinary clinic. "You see details that adults miss because we're too focused on the technical stuff. It's like drawing," Tommy explained seriously. "You have to look at what makes something special, not just what it looks like." That evening, as they uploaded and reviewed the day's photographs on Sophia's laptop, Jake marveled at the quality of her work and the growing portfolio she was building. Word about her skills was spreading through Cedar Falls' tight-knit business community, and she'd already received inquiries about additional projects. "I've been thinking," she said as they browsed through images of the veterinary clinic staff, interacting with grateful pet owners, about what it would mean to really put down roots here. To stop thinking of this as a temporary situation and start building something permanent. What would that look like? Jake asked, though his heart was already racing with hope. "Well, I'd need to find a permanent place to work, maybe rent a small office space downtown where I could meet with clients. I'd like to formalize my business registration, get proper insurance, maybe even hire an assistant eventually if things grow enough." She paused, clicking through the photos of the bookstore's cozy reading nooks. "And I'd like to have conversations about what it means for us to be together long term. About practical things like finances and household responsibilities, but also about bigger things like what we want our family to look like 5 years from now." Jake reached over and closed the laptop, wanting her full attention for what he was about to say. "Sophia, I want you to know that when I think about the future now, I can't imagine it without you in it. Not as a temporary guest or even as a girlfriend, but as a true partner in everything, raising Tommy, building a life together, creating the kind of home that Emma and I always dreamed about." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that I love you," Jake said simply. "I'm saying that I want to marry you someday, when we're both ready, when Tommy's ready, when it feels right for all of us. I'm saying that you've transformed our lives in ways I never thought possible, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you've made us." Sophia launched herself into his arms, laughing and crying simultaneously. "Yes," she said against his neck. "Yes to all of it. Yes to building a life together. Yes to loving Tommy like my own. Yes to everything we can create together." From upstairs came the sound of Tommy's voice calling down to them. "Are you guys having a happy moment? Because I can hear Happy crying, and I want to come give hugs." They separated long enough to call back, "Come on down, buddy. We definitely need some Tommy hugs right now." As Tommy thundered down the stairs in his pajamas, Jake looked at Sophia, her face glowing with happiness, her eyes bright with tears of joy, and felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a man barely surviving the weight of single parenthood, focused only on making it through each day. Now he was part of a family that had been born from crisis and tragedy, but had grown into something beautiful and strong. Tommy launched himself into their arms, and they held him between them, the three of them forming a circle of love that felt unbreakable. At that moment, Jake understood what Tommy had meant about butterflies learning to fly together. They had all undergone their own metamorphosis individually, and as a family, and what had emerged was more beautiful than anything they could have imagined alone. "I love you both so much," Tommy said seriously, his arms wrapped around both adults. "We're going to be the best family ever." "We already are, buddy," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We already are." 2 months later, on a crisp December morning, Jake stood in the doorway of what had once been his home office and watched Sophia arrange her professional portfolio on the desk she'd purchased the week before. The room had been transformed into a proper workspace, complete with a drafting table, professional lighting, and samples of her growing client work displayed on the walls. What struck him most wasn't the physical changes, but the confidence with which she moved through the space. This was her domain now, her sanctuary for creativity and business. "The Patterson nonprofit meeting is at 10, she said without looking up from her laptop. "Then lunch with the Chamber of Commerce group, and the final presentation for the tourism board at 3. I should be home by 4:30 to help Tommy with his science project." Jake marveled at how naturally she'd integrated their family schedule with her professional commitments. In the past 8 weeks, Sophia's graphic design business had exploded beyond her wildest expectations. Word of mouth in Cedar Falls traveled fast, and her combination of professional skill and personal attention to each client's story had created a waiting list of businesses eager to work with her. "What's the tourism board project about again?" Jake asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "They want to rebrand Cedar Falls as a destination for families seeking authentic small-town experiences. The idea is to highlight our local businesses, outdoor recreation opportunities, and community events in a way that attracts weekend visitors and maybe even convinces some city folks to relocate here permanently." She pulled up a series of design mock-ups on her screen, and Jake felt his breath catch. The promotional material somehow captured the essence of everything he loved about his hometown: the warmth of community connections, the beauty of the surrounding countryside, the sense that this was a place where people still looked out for each other. "This is incredible, Sophia. You've managed to make Cedar Falls look like somewhere people would actually want a vacation." "Cedar Falls is somewhere people would want a vacation," she corrected with a smile. "I just figured out how to show them what we already know, that there's magic in small towns if you know how to look for it." The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Sophia answered with her professional greeting. "Morrison Design Studios. This is Sophia." Jake still felt a thrill every time he heard her use their shared last name for the business, even though they weren't technically married yet. The decision had been practical. It created brand recognition in a small town where everyone knew Jake Morrison, but it also felt like a preview of their future together. "Yes, Mrs. Davidson, I can absolutely have those wedding invitation designs ready by Friday," Sophia was saying. "And congratulations on your daughter's engagement. I'm honored to be part of making her day special." As she discussed design details with her client, Jake found himself thinking about their own wedding plans. They'd set a date for the following June, wanting to give Tommy time to fully adjust to their new family dynamic and allowing Sophia to establish her business before taking on the additional identity of Jake's wife. The planning process had been entirely different from what either of them had experienced before. Jake's first wedding to Emma had been a simple courthouse ceremony followed by a backyard reception, born of financial necessity and their desire to start their married life without debt. Sophia's aborted wedding to Richard had been an elaborate affair that prioritized appearance over meaning, every detail chosen to impress rather than express their love. This time, they were creating something that reflected who they truly were as a couple and as a family. The ceremony would take place in Emma's garden, which Sophia had lovingly restored over the fall months. Tommy would serve as the ring bearer, a role he took so seriously that he'd been practicing his processional walk for weeks. The reception would be held in their backyard, with food provided by Peterson's Bakery and decorations created by Sophia herself. "That was Mrs. Davidson from the floral shop," Sophia said as she hung up the phone. "Her daughter saw the website I designed for Henderson's Hardware, and wants me to create her wedding invitations. Apparently, word is spreading that I can make anything look elegant. Because you can, Jake said simply. You see beauty in things other people overlook, and then you help them see it too. Sophia's cheeks flushed with pleasure at the compliment. Even after months of successful projects and satisfied clients, she still seemed surprised when people praised her work. Jake suspected it would take years to fully undo the damage Richard had done to her self-confidence, but every completed project and happy client seemed to rebuild another piece of her professional identity. Speaking of seeing beauty in overlooked things, she said, closing her laptop and moving to sit beside him, I have something I want to discuss with you. The serious tone in her voice made Jake give her his full attention. What's on your mind? I've been thinking about Emma's wedding dress. Jake felt his stomach tighten slightly. Sophia had never brought up Emma's belongings before, respecting the fact that many of his late wife's possessions were still exactly where she'd left them. He'd been slowly working through the emotional process of deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what to save for Tommy when he was older, but progress was slow and sometimes painful. What about it? He asked carefully. I know you've been struggling with what to do with her things, and I want you to know that I completely understand why that's difficult. But I had an idea about the dress specifically, and I wanted to run it by you before I mentioned it to Tommy. Sophia took his hand, her touch grounding him for whatever emotional territory they were about to navigate. I was thinking that maybe we could have it altered not to wear myself, but to create something special for our wedding that would honor Emma's memory and include her in our celebration. Jake felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. What kind of something? I was thinking we could use parts of the fabric to create a ring pillow for Tommy to carry, or maybe a small piece sewn into my bouquet wrap. Something that would symbolically include Emma in our ceremony, without trying to replace her or diminish her importance to your family. The suggestion was so thoughtful, so perfectly balanced between honoring the past and embracing the future, that Jake felt tears spring to his eyes. Sophia, that's beautiful. I think Emma would love that idea. I hope so, Sophia said softly. I never want Tommy to feel like loving me means forgetting his mother. I want him to understand that love multiplies, it doesn't divide. Having me in his life doesn't take anything away from what he had with Emma. You know that's exactly what it means, Jake said, pulling her closer. Tommy understands that better than most adults would. Yesterday, he told Mrs. Rodriguez that he has one mom in heaven who teaches butterflies how to paint, and one mom on earth who teaches him how to take photographs. He said both moms love him completely, just in different ways. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. He said that? He's been talking about you as his Earth mom for weeks now. I was going to tell you, but I wanted to make sure you were comfortable with that kind of language. Comfortable? Sophia laughed through her tears. Jake, being Tommy's Earth mom is the greatest honor of my life. I love that little boy so much it sometimes takes my breath away. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them processing the magnitude of the family they'd created together. Jake thought about how impossible this scenario would have seemed just 6 months earlier sitting in his home office, discussing wedding plans with a woman who wasn't Emma, feeling genuinely excited about the future instead of just surviving. Each day, there's something else, Sophia said, her voice carrying a note of nervous excitement. Something I've been thinking about, but wasn't sure how to bring up. You can bring up anything with me, Jake assured her. What is it? I want to adopt Tommy. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Jake felt his heart stop, then begin beating double time as he processed what she was saying. I know it might seem presumptuous, she continued quickly, and I know there are legal complications since Emma is his biological mother, and I obviously can't replace that. But I want to make our family official in every way possible. I want Tommy to know that my commitment to him isn't dependent on my relationship with you, That even if something happened between us, he would still be my son. Jake stared at her, overwhelmed by the generosity and depth of her love for his child. Sophia, do you understand what you're saying? I'm saying that I want to be Tommy's legal mother in addition to his earth mom. I want my name on his school records and medical forms. I want to have the legal right to make decisions about his welfare if something happens to you. I want him to inherit from me, and I want to be responsible for his future in every official way possible. She took a shaky breath, her vulnerability evident. I'm saying that this isn't just about being in love with you, Jake. I'm in love with our entire family, and I want to make it permanent and legal and unbreakable. Jake felt as if his heart might burst from the intensity of his emotions. Have you talked to Tommy about this? Not yet. I wanted to make sure you were open to the idea first. But Jake, if you're concerned about how he'd react, I think you're underestimating how much he wants this too. Last week he asked me if getting married meant I'd officially be his mom, and when I said I wasn't sure about the official part, he looked so disappointed. Jake thought about Tommy's recent behavior, the way he'd started introducing Sophia to people as my mom Sophia, the pride in his voice when he talked about her work, the complete trust he showed in her judgment and care. The adoption would simply formalize what had already happened in their hearts. Yes, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, I want you to adopt Tommy. I can't think of anything that would make me happier than knowing he's legally and permanently yours. Sophia threw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying simultaneously. Really? You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Jake replied, holding her tight. Tommy is going to be over the moon when we tell him. They were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening and Tommy's voice calling out, I'm home. And I have the best news ever. Jake and Sophia exchanged amused glances. Tommy had been staying after school for art club on Tuesdays, and his enthusiasm for these sessions often resulted in dramatic announcements about his latest creative achievements. We're upstairs, buddy, Jake called back. Come tell us about your news. Tommy's footsteps thundered up the stairs, and he burst into the office with his characteristic energy, his backpack still slung over his shoulder and his cheeks flushed from the cold December air. Guess what happened at the art club today? He announced without a preamble. Mrs. Patterson asked if I wanted to help design the decorations for the winter festival, and I said yes, but then I said I'd have to ask my parents first because that's what responsible kids do. Jake felt his heart skip at Tommy's casual use of the plural parents. Even without the legal adoption, Tommy had already made the emotional leap to considering Sophia his parent. And then, Tommy continued, his excitement building, Mrs. Patterson said she'd love to meet both my parents and maybe hire Sophia to help with some of the other festival decorations, because she's heard amazing things about Morrison Design Studios. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Sophia said, her voice warm with pride. I'd love to work on the festival with you. Really? We could be like a team, a mother-son design team. Tommy's eyes were shining with excitement. Oh, and I have something else to tell you. Remember how I've been thinking about what to call Sophia after you guys get married? Jake and Sophia exchanged a meaningful look. Tommy had been grappling with this question for weeks, trying out different variations of mom and mother and mama to see what felt right. What did you decide? Sophia asked gently. Well, I was talking to Mrs. Rodriguez about it, and she told me about her family in Mexico, where some kids have more than one mom with different names. She said I could call you whatever felt right to me, as long as it came from my heart. Tommy took a deep breath, as if preparing for an important announcement. I want to call you Mama Sophia, because you're my mama here on Earth, but you're still Sophia too, and I don't want to forget either part of who you are to me. Sophia's face crumpled with emotion, and she knelt down to Tommy's level, pulling him into a tight hug. Mama Sophia, she repeated softly. I love that so much, Tommy. It's perfect. And I have one more thing, Tommy said, pulling back from the hug with a serious expression. I want to ask you something important. What is it, buddy? Jake asked, curious about what other profound insights his 7-year-old son might have developed. Mama Sophia, will you adopt me? So it's official that you're my mama and I'm your son? Because I want everyone to know that we chose each other. And that you'll be my mama forever, not just until I grow up. The silence that followed was charged with pure emotion. Jake felt tears streaming down his face as he watched Sophia struggle to find words adequate to the moment. Tommy, she finally managed, her voice breaking with joy. There is nothing in the entire world I want more than to adopt you and be your official mama. Yes, sweetheart. Yes, absolutely yes. Tommy launched himself back into her arms, and Jake joined the embrace, the three of them holding each other in the middle of Sophia's office as snow began to fall outside the window. In that moment, Jake felt the presence of Emma so strongly it took his breath away, not as a ghost or a source of guilt, but as a loving presence blessing their new beginning. I love you both so much, Tommy said seriously, his words muffled against Sophia's shoulder. We're going to be the best official family ever. We already are, Jake replied, echoing the words he'd spoken months earlier. We already are. As they held each other in their circle of love, Jake thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a runaway bride in a diner, a single father struggling with grief, and a little boy searching for magic in a world that had taken his mother away. But what had emerged was something beautiful and strong and permanent, a family built on choice rather than chance, on love rather than obligation, on hope rather than fear. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Cedar Falls in pristine white that made everything look new and full of possibility. Inside their home, three people who had found each other in the most unexpected way continued to hold each other tight, already planning the official ceremonies that would make permanent what their hearts had known for months. They were a family. They had always been a family. And now, finally, they would make it official in every way that mattered. 6 months later, on a perfect June morning when Emma's garden was in full bloom, Jake stood at the altar he and Tommy had built together from reclaimed wood found at the construction site. The backyard had been transformed into a wedding venue that captured everything authentic about their love story. Simple, beautiful, and deeply personal. Sophia had been right about the garden needing a season to rest and figure out what it wanted to become. Under her careful tending through the winter and spring, it had exploded into the most magnificent display Jake had ever seen. Roses climbed the trellis Emma had installed years earlier, their blooms now fuller and more vibrant than they'd ever been. The vegetable beds overflowed with tomatoes, herbs, and flowers that attracted clouds of butterflies, a detail that hadn't been lost on any of them. Tommy stood beside Jake, wearing a miniature version of his father's navy suit and holding the ring pillow that had been carefully crafted from Emma's wedding dress. His hair was perfectly combed for once, and his face glowed with the kind of pure joy that only children could radiate when they saw their deepest wishes coming true. She looks like a princess, Dad, Tommy whispered as the music began and guests turned toward the house. Jake's breath caught as Sophia appeared on the back porch, radiant in a simple cream-colored dress that she'd designed herself. She'd chosen fabric that caught the morning light, creating the illusion that she was glowing from within. Her auburn hair was swept up in an elegant style, adorned with small white flowers from the garden, and she carried a bouquet wrapped in lace that had been carefully preserved from Emma's dress. But what took Jake's breath away wasn't her beauty. Stunning as she was, it was the confidence in her step, the joy radiating from her smile, the way she looked at him and Tommy as if they were the most precious things in her universe. This was a woman who knew exactly where she belonged and was walking toward the life she'd chosen rather than running from the one that had been chosen for her. As she walked down the aisle between their gathered friends and neighbors, including Marge from Mitchell's Diner, who was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Jake felt Emma's presence so strongly, it was almost tangible. Not as sadness or guilt, but as pure love and approval. This wedding wasn't a replacement for what he'd lost. It was a continuation of what Emma had started when she'd taught him that love was meant to be shared, not hoarded. "Dearly beloved," began Pastor Williams, the same minister who had presided over Emma's funeral, and who had watched their family's journey with quiet support over the past year. "We gather today not just to witness the union of Jake and Sophia, but to celebrate the creation of a family built on love, choice, and the courage to heal." The ceremony they'd written together was unlike anything traditional. Instead of the usual vows about sickness and health, they spoke about their commitment to growing together, to supporting each other's dreams, and to creating a home where love multiplied rather than divided. When it came time for rings, Tommy stepped forward with such solemn dignity that several guests audibly sighed with affection. "These rings represent not just the bond between husband and wife," Pastor Williams announced, "but the circle of love that encompasses this entire family." After Jake and Sophia exchanged rings, Tommy surprised everyone by producing a third ring from his pocket, a simple silver band that Sophia had secretly helped him choose weeks earlier. "This is for you, Mama Sophia," he said clearly, his 7-year-old voice carrying across the garden. "It's a promise ring from me to you, promising that I'll always be your son and you'll always be my mama, no matter what." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden as Sophia knelt down to accept Tommy's ring, slipping it onto her right hand with reverent care. "And I promise you, Tommy Morrison, that you will always be my beloved son, and I will always be proud to be your mama." The adoption had been finalized 3 weeks earlier in a courtroom ceremony that had been emotional in its own way, but this public declaration felt like the true completion of their family circle. "By the power vested in me by the state of Michigan," Pastor Williams announced with a voice thick with emotion, "I now pronounce you husband and wife, and officially recognize this beautiful family as legally and spiritually united. Jake, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, joyful, and full of promise. When they separated, Tommy immediately threw himself into their arms, creating the three-way hug that had become their signature gesture. The garden erupted in applause and cheers, with someone, probably Marge, shouting, "About time." The reception flowed seamlessly into the celebration, with tables arranged throughout the backyard and string lights creating magic as the day transitioned toward evening. Peterson's Bakery had outdone themselves with a 3-tier cake decorated with delicate sugar flowers that looked as if they'd been picked from Emma's garden. The top layer would be saved for their first anniversary, a tradition that felt both hopeful and grounding. As the afternoon progressed, Jake found himself watching the interactions between their guests with deep satisfaction. Bill Henderson was deep in conversation with Danny Reeves about a potential renovation project for the hardware store. Mrs. Chun, their former babysitter, was admiring Sophia's portfolio with several other local business owners who were clearly interested in her services. Tommy was leading a group of children in a butterfly hunt through the garden, explaining the different species with the expertise he'd gained through months of observation and study. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Sophia appeared beside him, her wedding dress now slightly grass-stained from playing with the children, but her smile more radiant than ever. "Just thinking about how different this day might have been if you hadn't walked into Mitchell's Diner that morning," Jake replied, pulling her close. "How different all our lives would be. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd chosen a different diner, or if you decided to skip breakfast that day?" Jake considered the question seriously. "I think we would have found each other somehow. Maybe not that day, maybe not that way, but I believe some connections are inevitable. Like butterflies finding their way to the right garden, exactly like that." As the sun began to set, casting golden light across their celebration, Tommy climbed onto a chair and called for everyone's attention. The conversations gradually quieted as guests turned toward the 7-year-old who had somehow become the emotional center of the entire gathering. "I want to say something," he announced, with the seriousness he reserved for important occasions. "A year ago, it was just me and Dad, and we were pretty sad most of the time because we missed Mom. But then Sophia came to our house, and everything started getting better." Jake felt his throat tighten as he watched his son's earnest face. "Sophia didn't try to replace Mom or make us forget her," Tommy continued. "She just loved us exactly how we were, and she helped us remember how to be happy again. And now we're a family with 2 moms, one in heaven who sends us butterflies, and one on earth who makes the best pancakes and takes the coolest pictures." He paused, looking directly at Sophia with eyes that held wisdom far beyond his years. "Mama Sophia, thank you for choosing us. Thank you for making our house feel like home again. And thank you for showing me that families can grow in beautiful ways, even after sad things happen." The garden was completely silent except for the distant sound of church bells and the gentle buzzing of bees among the flowers. Then someone started clapping. Jake thought it might have been Marge again, and soon the entire gathering was on their feet, applauding not just Tommy's words but the journey that had brought them all to this moment. As the evening wound down, and guests began to say their goodbyes, Jake, Sophia, and Tommy found themselves alone in the garden, surrounded by the remnants of their perfect day. The string lights twinkled overhead, and the air was filled with the scent of roses and the sound of crickets beginning their nighttime chorus. "So," Sophia said, settling onto the porch swing with Tommy curled against her side, "how does it feel to be officially married?" "It feels exactly right," Jake replied, sitting on Tommy's other side so their son was sandwiched between his parents. "Like something that was always meant to happen finally did." "I have a confession," Tommy said sleepily. "I've been calling Sophia Mama in my head for months. It just felt right." "I have a confession too," Sophia said softly. "The first night I stayed here, I lay awake thinking about how much I already loved both of you. And it scared me because I'd never felt anything that strong before. And my confession," Jake added, "is that I knew I wanted to marry you about 2 weeks after you moved in, but I was terrified you'd think I was crazy for falling in love so fast." They sat in comfortable silence, watching fireflies begin to dance among the flowers. The garden that had once been Emma's alone now belonged to all of them, a living symbol of how love could grow and change and expand without losing its essential. "Nature, what happens now?" Tommy asked, his voice drowsy with contentment. "Now we live happily ever after," Sophia replied simply. "Not because everything will always be perfect, but because we'll face whatever comes next together, as a family." "Like the butterflies in my dream," Tommy murmured, "flying together and making beautiful pictures." As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Jake thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with heartbreak and loss, with a woman fleeing from cruelty and a man drowning in grief. But it had become something beautiful, a story of healing and hope, of love multiplying rather than dividing, of a family choosing each other across all the obstacles that might have kept them apart. In the morning, they would wake up as the Morrison family officially, legally, permanently. Jake and Sophia Morrison, and their son Tommy, whose adoption papers now bore both their names. They would continue building Sophia's business, raising their remarkable son, and creating new traditions while honoring the memory of the woman whose love had made all of this possible. But tonight, they simply sat together in Emma's garden, which was now their garden surrounded by butterflies and fireflies, and the infinite possibility of tomorrow. They were a family born from crisis but strengthened by choice, proof that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the spaces left behind by loss. And in Cedar Falls, Michigan, in a garden full of roses and butterflies, 3 people who had found each other in the most unexpected way held each other close and knew, with absolute certainty, that they were exactly where they belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.